The DJI Action 4 is here, which means it's time to find out if we have a new action camera king in town. And before we start this review and comparison between the Action 4 with the Action 3, as well as the GoPro 11, I just want to give a quick disclaimer. And that's that DJI aren't paying me for this video, but they did send me out the camera for free before launch to test out and create this video. And I have worked with DJI in the past on things like launch videos. On the other hand, with GoPro, I've been using GoPros for a long time and am a recipient of the $1 Million Challenge. So take with that information what you will. I'm gonna try and make this video as unbiased as possible and give you my genuine thoughts and opinions on these two cameras. So when it comes to build quality, the Action 3 and the Action 4 are basically identical. The only differences I could find are that the mic ports on the top are slightly different, and DJI's used dark red accents instead of the original orange accents. All the ND filters will work for both of them, all the mounts and accessories will work for both of these cameras. Now when it comes to comparing the Action 4 in size to the GoPro 11, they're very similar in size, with the GoPro being slightly bigger. They're the same width and the same thickness, but when it comes to height, the GoPro is slightly taller. And the GoPro is also slightly heavier until you add in the magnetic quick release mount that you have to use with the Action. Then the Action weighs slightly more than the GoPro. When it comes to battery doors and accessibility, I actually way prefer the DJI Action for this. I find that the doors are much easier to open, and with the GoPro, I often struggle to open this battery door just because it's quite difficult with my really bad nails. And on top of that, I often get the door stuck on the actual thumb screw used to lock in the GoPro, which means sometimes I have to remove the whole GoPro from the mount just to take the battery or the SD card out. So both cameras have a screen on the back as well as on the front. And these screens are of comparable brightness, and I haven't really noticed a big difference with being able to see them out in daylight. However, the DJI Action 4 has a touchscreen on the front, which is really nice because it means you can actually change all the settings from the front of the screen as well. And the GoPro doesn't have that. So for all of those reasons, I'm gonna give the win of build quality and design to the Action 4. When it comes to aspect ratios, the GoPro has an 8x7 almost square sensor, and the Action 4 has the more traditional 4x3 sensor. Now, I've really come to like the GoPro sensor for this because it just makes shooting so much simpler and less to think about. Because of that square sensor, you can crop to landscape or vertical after the fact, and you don't need a plan before you do the shot which one you want to use. Now, the Action 4 can do quite a tall shot with 4x3, but it just doesn't match that almost square sensor of the GoPro 11. And this is something I wish all cameras could actually do, because lenses at the end of the day always create a circular image. So by using a square sensor, you would capture as much of what the lens is producing as possible. And I really don't like having to think before shooting, do I want the shot in vertical or landscape, or even worse, having to shoot both of them in the same shoot. So you have shots for social media and you have shots for YouTube. So for me, the GoPro 11 is a clear winner in this category. So for sound quality, I decided to put the cameras head to head while I was on a hike I did shooting with these cameras. And just bear in mind, it was 36 degrees Celsius or almost 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So it was hot and I was sweaty, so I apologize for that. But here is the test. Just hiked up this fairly large hill to these old castle ruins. And I'm actually gonna do some FPV flying through the walls of this castle, and I think it could be really cool to test out these cameras. And I thought while I'm here, I might as well do a little microphone test. I've got all three cameras on a rig here, so I'm gonna cut between the audio of the different cameras and walk around so you can see some different lighting scenarios. So firstly, this is the GoPro 11, and from what I can see, it's actually quite a lot tighter on the front screen. It's not as wide of a field of view. And now we're gonna cut to the Action 4, and you'll see there is a bit of wind here. See that flag over there flapping? So we'll also see how they handle the wind. And yeah, I think there's gonna be a lot of cool spaces to fly around here. And this is the Action 3. So how is this audio from the Action 3? Walking around, so you can also see a few different lighting scenarios. Let's walk into the shade here. And now let's just go back to the GoPro 11. And let's go into the shade here. Now there's a lot less wind here, so there shouldn't be any wind noise, so we can test out the audio with that. It's also not that echoey. And back to the Action 4. How does this audio sound? Let's check this out. This is actually really cool. I'm super excited to fly through this gap here. Just really hope I don't crash. And let's go back to the Action 3. How does it sound in this non-windy atmosphere? So for me personally, I like the sound of the Action 4 the most. I think it's got a slight improvement to the Action 3, although it is really similar. And for me, the GoPro just doesn't sound as true to life as the other two cameras. But again, it's up to you. You can listen to these samples for yourself and decide which you prefer. But for me personally, the Action 4 is the winner for this category. So I think FPV is actually the biggest and most important category for myself and a lot of people who also just use action cameras for this purpose. And with the Action 3 compared to the GoPro 11, I always chose the GoPro 11 for FPV, and there's two main reasons for that. The first being that the GoPro has sharpness adjustments. I really don't like over-sharpened looks from smaller cameras, so being able to set the GoPro to a low sharpness level was a really big plus for me. Then on top of that, with the Action 3, I could only use the rock steady inbuilt stabilization in the camera, whereas GoPro has real steady, which is like magic. It works really well to stabilize the camera and nothing is built in, so you can adjust all the settings afterwards, which I way prefer. DJI has thankfully fixed both of those problems now with the Action 4, and you can finally adjust the sharpness level of the image, and I always set it to -2, and I think that gives me a really good cinematic look, and I love the picture quality with that setting. On top of that, you can now use gyro flow with the Action 4. To do this, you need to set the camera to wide, not ultra wide, and then you also need to have rock steady turned off. And from that, the camera will save the gyro data, which you can use in gyro flow and change all the settings you want, and it gives really good results, and I'm really happy with this. Unfortunately, in my testing, the drone freaked out and only let me do one flight where I was just warming up, so my footage isn't as good as I would have hoped, but at least I got some test footage with the Action 4 on my FPV, and I can share my thoughts with you. I've used the GoPro 11 extensively for FPV, so I can still give you an accurate comparison and what I think is the better camera for FPV. So when it comes to choosing an FPV camera, I would previously always choose the GoPro 11 over the Action 3. But with the Action 4, all of that has changed, and now I would always pick the Action 4 over the GoPro 11 for FPV. Now, in saying that, both of these cameras are excellent for FPV, and you're not going to go wrong with either of them, to be perfectly honest. But the reason I would go for the Action 4 instead of the GoPro is I honestly just prefer the image a little better. I like the super wide field of view and less fisheye distortion, which means at the end of the day, after stabilization, you do get a wider image. And on top of that, the Action 4 does have that much larger sensor, which gives you better low light performance. So when you're flying in situations like sunset or even a bit after dark, the Action 4 is going to destroy the GoPro in this category. So for me, they're really, really close. Both of them are going to be really good, but the Action 4 just takes the win here for me. Now for video quality. And honestly, this is by far the most important factor for me when it comes to choosing an action camera. Because at the end of the day, I can deal with a few little quirks or annoyances with the camera if it's going to give me the best video quality I can get. When it comes to resolution, the GoPro does have a higher spec of 5.3K versus 4K on the Action 4 and the Action 3. But when it came down to it and I zoomed in up to 700% on both of the cameras, I couldn't see any difference in actual detail retention and sharpness between the two cameras. So I think this upgrade in resolution is more of a gimmick than anything else, and both of these cameras are going to deliver equal levels of actual detail and sharpness in the image. Now when it comes to automatic white balance, the GoPro does tend to seem to favor a more warmer look overall, and I think this is because people generally find that more pleasing to look at. But for me, the Action 4 and 3 do a better job of getting an accurate white balance of what it actually looks like. So some people might prefer the warmer look from the GoPro, but for me, being accurate to real life is more important. So the Action 4 is better for that. So when it came to dynamic range, I was actually quite surprised because they both basically were equal to one another. And I thought with the Action 4 having a bigger sensor, it would have better dynamic range. But to be honest, there's not really a huge difference here. However, the DJI Action 4 does have less noise in the shadows. Now, one extra difference between the Action 3 and the 4 is that the Action 3 could only shoot at D-Cine-like, whereas with the Action 4 we now have D-Log. And I have noticed this is a quite a lot flatter profile, which means you're gonna get more room for color grading in post, and this is a really nice thing to have because it also gives you a bit more dynamic range. So one thing to know about the lenses of these cameras is that the GoPro does have a much more fisheye look than the Action 4 and the Action 3. And I prefer having less of a fisheye because it means when you correct the image to be rectilinear with these lines to be straight, you have to crop a lot less of the image. And on top of the Action 4 having a wider field of view, the less fisheye means that it's less distorted and you get a wider image after cropping and correcting that fisheye effect. But again, they are both really good when it comes to image quality. I wouldn't be disappointed if I had to use the GoPro. At the end of the day, it all comes down to preference, but for me, the Action 4 is the winner when it comes to video quality performance. So you probably know by now that the Action 4 has a much larger sensor than the Action 3 and the GoPro 11. It's got a sensor size of 1/1.3 inches compared to 1/1.7 inches from the Action 3 and 1/1.9 inches from the GoPro 11. And to put it simply, this just means that the camera has better low light performance, and it really does show in the test clips that I got. So I took all three cameras to shoot a fireworks show in Cannes to test out their low light performance. And of course I had all the cameras set to identical settings with a max ISO of 3200, shutter speed of 1/50th of a second, and 4K 30 or 5.3K at 30. And these are the results I got. So it surprised me to see that the Action 3 actually did really well in these tests. It maintained quite a lot of detail and the noise performance was not too bad. It still looked usable in my opinion. But if we jump to the Action 4, you'll see that the noise performance is even better and that bigger sensor really starts to shine in this scenario. Now when we look at the GoPro, you can really see it starts to struggle. The image is just falling apart and it's really noisy in the shadows. So for me, it's very clear that while the Action 3 is good, the Action 4 beats both of these cameras by quite a long margin in the low light performance category. So it's clear that the Action 4 is the winner in this category, with the Action 3 being in second place and the GoPro 11 being in third place. And this is something that I think GoPro could really improve on in the GoPro 12. So I hope to see a larger sensor with that square format in the GoPro 12. So I love using action cameras for time lapses. I think they're a really perfect camera for it. One, because you can just turn them on, start recording, and you'll get a beautiful time lapse or hyperlapse. And two, they're really nice and light and small, so you can mount them in pretty crazy positions where mounting a larger camera would be really difficult. So when it comes to the Action 3 and the Action 4, they basically have identical results in my opinion. All the settings are the same and the final results also look really similar. Now for me, the GoPro 11 takes the win in this category for two reasons. Number one, the Action 3 and 4 are limited to 16:9 format, whereas the GoPro can record in 4:3 in 5.3K resolution, which I just prefer for being able to reframe afterwards. On top of that, the GoPro does seem to handle changing in exposures a bit better. I did these tests where I was driving on the road, and when I went through tunnels, the DJI Action 3 and 4 took really long to expose the darkness of the tunnel and then the brightness once you leave the tunnel, whereas the GoPro nailed this much better. So for me, the GoPro is the winner of this category. So I decided to do some slow motion testing with all three of these cameras set to 4K 120 FPS in 16:9 format with normal color. To be honest, all of the clips look really good and there's not a huge difference between them. The only thing I did notice was a slight improvement in dynamic range from the Action 4 footage, but overall I'm gonna have to give them a tie because they all look really similar. I do think the Action 4 would pull ahead in this for low light situations just because of that bigger sensor. It's able to maintain higher shutter speeds with lower ISO values to get the same exposure. Now, battery life is really important when it comes to choosing an action camera. So I decided to put all three of these cameras through some pretty extreme testing. And the first I did was for extreme cold. Popped a thermometer in here and it's about minus 18 degrees Celsius. So it's gonna be a really good test. And we've got the cameras in here. I've just turned them on and they're all in 100%, so fully charged. And all identical settings. So 100% brightness on the screens. They're all set to turn off the screens after 1 minute. And they're all in 4K 4:3 60p with rock steady on these guys and hyper smooth on this guy with auto camera settings across the board. We're over 30 minutes now, so it's time for another check-in. And let's check what's going on. The Action 3 is in 69%, Action 4 is 70%, and GoPro is on 50%. So we're just under an hour, and I don't know if you just saw, but the GoPro just shut off because it ran out of battery. And the Action 3 is on 36, and the Action 4 is on 38, so these guys are still running strong. So we've just reached the 1 hour 25 mark and I just heard the Action 3 turn off, so it's no longer recording, but the Action 4 is still going with 8%, so we'll see how far that goes before it dies. So I'm sitting at 1 hour 31 minutes and the Action 4 has just turned off because it's run out of battery. The GoPro 11 lasted 1 hour, the Action 3 lasted 1 hour and 25 minutes, and the Action 4 lasted 1 hour and 31 minutes. This means that the Action 4 lasted 7% longer than the Action 3 and 52% longer than the GoPro in extreme cold. Next, I decided to test the camera in more realistic testing scenarios. So for this test, I decided to put the cameras under the air conditioning to make sure they don't overheat. And of course, all the camera settings were identical across the board at 4K 60 frames per second, 4:3 aspect ratio, stabilization turned on, and the screens were also set to stay on all the time. So the GoPro 11 lasted 48 minutes, the Action 3 lasted 57 minutes, and the Action 4 lasted 1 hour and 12 minutes. This means that the Action 4 outlasted the Action 3 by 26% and it outlasted the GoPro 11 by 50%. Now, from previous examples, I always knew that the Actions would outlast the GoPro, but I really did not expect for the Action 4 to have better life than the Action 3. I mean, DJI didn't even tell me this when they sent me the camera, so it's a really pleasant result, especially considering it's got that larger sensor, which in theory should be more power hungry. So the Action 4 is a clear winner when it comes to battery life. The user interface and menus of a camera might seem like a not very important subject, but for me it's really important because it completely changes the way you use and interact with an action camera. You should definitely consider it when choosing an action camera to buy. Now, both the Action 3 and 4 and the GoPro 11 do have fairly simple menus and they're easy to use. However, I think the DJI system is so much better and simpler and easier to use. The GoPro menu can get really convoluted and has some really strange quirks about it that I don't quite understand. Changing the manual exposure settings for a GoPro is way overcomplicated in my opinion. The shutter speed, the ISO min, the ISO max, the exposure compensation are all in different mini menus inside the menu with a little scroll wheel, and it just makes it really difficult and complicated. However, with the Action 3 and 4, it's all done from one main screen, and you can also choose ranges for your ISO values and your shutter speed values, and on top of that, you can get a live view of how the ISO is changing as well as how the shutter speed is changing, and this is really helpful when you just want to dial in that exposure. On top of that, the GoPro has a really bizarre quirk when it comes to changing the frame rate options available to you. Now, if you want to choose between 24, 30, 60, 120 FPS, or 25, 50, 100 FPS, to do that, you have to go into a whole separate menu and change the anti-flicker option from 50 Hz to 60 Hz or vice versa. And this is just really weird. I don't understand why you don't just have all the settings right there at the bottom and people can choose whatever they want without having to go into a whole separate menu. So for me, the Action 4 and 3 easily win the user interface and menu category. So for the Action 3 and the Action 4, the electronic stabilization is identical and they both have Rocksteady and Rocksteady Plus, whereas the GoPro has their own version of stabilization called Hypersmooth and Hypersmooth Boost. And to be honest, they're a complete tie in this category. Both of them are equally as good. They're both excellent for stabilization and you really don't need a gimbal anymore for these action cameras. Overheating is a really contentious subject when it comes to these cameras. And all across YouTube, I've seen many videos saying that the GoPro overheats way before the Action 3. But I think my results will really surprise you. So it's time to test the cameras to the other extreme in the heat. Now I have a thermometer out there in the shade reading 37.4 degrees Celsius, so it is hot. So in this super demanding test, I was really shocked by the results. In the full sun, the Action 3 overheated and stopped recording at 3 minutes 48 seconds, the Action 4 at 5 minutes and 10 seconds, and the GoPro 11 at 11 minutes and 17 seconds. Now, this is a major difference between these three cameras and the GoPro is clearly the winner here. So I was really surprised by this and decided to do further testing. So I let all the cameras cool down for over an hour so they could all get to room temperature, and I did some more testing inside my apartment where it was 22 degrees Celsius. And the results were really interesting again. The Action 3 overheated at 15 minutes and 22 seconds, the Action 4 at 20 minutes and 43 seconds, and the GoPro 11 at 22 minutes and 13 seconds. So a lot closer this time, but the GoPro still beat out the other two cameras. I decided to do a third test. Now, of course, I let all the cameras cool down for over an hour so they were at room temperature, and I took them outside again. This time a bit cooler at 34 degrees Celsius, and I kept them in the shade. And for this, I also used a less demanding setting of 4K 30 FPS with the screens on all the time and also stabilization on. This time the Action 4 lasted 30 minutes, the Action 3 lasted 30 minutes and 56 seconds, and the GoPro 11 32 minutes and 50 seconds. So while they were all really close this time, the GoPro won again. All of my tests, the GoPro 11 outlasted the Action 3 and the Action 4, so it wins this category. So to compare the underwater performance of these three cameras, I took them down to Ez Beach where there were perfect crystal blue waters to test them in. And I used my triple action camera rig, which made me look like the ultimate dad, and I got some really weird looks, but it gets the results, so I don't mind. All three of the cameras looked good above the water, but when it came to below the water, the Action 4 had the most accurate colors by a long shot. And even in the same take where I went from underwater to above water, the Action 4 maintained a really good white balance for both of those scenarios. Whereas the Action 3 and the GoPro 11 had too much of a green tint to them. Now, to be honest, this is really easy to fix in post, especially if you're shooting in 10-bit, but people don't want to have to fix things in post. To have it straight out of the camera is definitely a bonus. On top of that, the Action 4 is now rated to a depth of 18 meters, whereas the Action 3 is rated to 16 meters and the GoPro 11 is rated to only 10 meters. Now, this is without an external housing, and if you want to go deeper, you can get an external housing for all of these cameras, but I prefer not to use a housing. So for me, the Action 4 is the clear winner when it comes to using an action camera for snorkeling or free diving or scuba diving. In conclusion, between the Action 3 and the Action 4, to be honest, if you're happy with the results you're getting from the Action 3, you really don't need to upgrade to the Action 4. So it's important to consider the Action 4 does have quite a few upgrades over the Action 3. The first one being the improvement in battery life, and this is a really big one. It makes it a lot easier to use the camera. The second being that much larger sensor, which is going to give you better low light performance, and it's going to give you better stabilization in low light. And what it's also going to give you is the option of D-Log versus D-Cine-like, which is better for color grading in post. And on top of that, we now have the ability to adjust the sharpness and noise reduction in camera, which is going to give you quite a lot more pleasing of an image. And on top of that, we also have a deeper depth rating of the cameras from 16 meters to 18 meters, as well as that improved automatic white balance for underwater shooting. And you can't forget that the Action 4 now has compatibility with gyroflow, which is going to be a big bonus for those using these cameras for FPV drones. So when it comes to the Action 4 versus GoPro 11, I want to start by saying that both of the cameras are going to give you really good image quality, and I would be happy with either of them. In saying that, as you would have seen from this video, the Action 4 has won a lot more categories for myself personally. For that reason, I would recommend getting the Action 4 over the GoPro 11. I think you're going to get better video results overall with a much easier user interface and overall user experience. If you're interested in picking up any of these three cameras, I'll have the links to the latest pricing in the description below. And don't forget that GoPro is coming out with the 12 in September this year, so I'm definitely going to be reviewing and comparing that camera to these cameras we have now, and then we'll see if there's a new king in town. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please consider subscribing if you did, and I'll see you in the next one.